I disagree with a lot of Trump supporters and their blind defense of this man. In the end, it's no different from a cult leader. I'm Shane Corey. This is episode 2 of Independent Citizen. On our first episode, we talked about a few things, and I wanted to clarify because I went back and watched the episode. And when you're in the middle of trying to express yourself, whether you're having a conversation with family members or friends or whomever, or doing a show like this, you're too immersed in your own words to really put a lot of thought into what you're saying. And I try to be thoughtful. But sometimes my mouth runs faster than my mind. But I do, there's a few things that I regret saying, and I don't want to go back and edit that out of the previous episode because I think it's genuine, but I think it's better to address it now and admit kind of my own mistakes or saying things I really didn't intend. When I spoke about the January 6th Capitol Hill riots or mobs that went in, I made light and said that they were just shuffling papers. The reality is, Capitol Hill officer Brian Sicknick was killed. His life was taken. His family is without the leader of their home now as a result of those riots. And so to say it was just shuffling papers, that is regrettable. And I apologize for that. Ashley Babbitt, the Air Force veteran who went in as a supporter of President Trump, jumped through the window and is shot by possibly a Capitol Hill police officer. That is, I have a lot more to say about that. That was an unjust killing an unarmed person, unarmed civilian, for jumping through a window. That was a step too far, not to diminish the murder of Officer Sicknick either. Both are tragic, but that is a result of civil unrest, which I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Another thing that I said that I kind of regretted was I came off as a blazing hypocrite in one section when I was talking about my partner and intolerance of the left. My partner, I love her to death. She's an amazing person, much smarter than I am. But she is incredibly passionate. She is liberal. And so we have interesting conversations every night. And I think what it comes down to is I've been in politics for 20 plus years now. I'm jaded. Like, I don't get passionate about anything, honestly. I want to understand and learn other viewpoints. And so when I see somebody getting riled up and not even wanting to hear an opposing viewpoint, I consider that intolerant. And it is. There's a form of intolerance. But in the end, for me to say that I don't change my views makes me intolerant. There's one view that I don't change. I really, thought about this morning when I was working out with Wes, who's behind the camera. And my core belief is liberty. I would rather take risks and live in a society that may be more dangerous, less stable, if we were moving in the direction of liberty and had more freedom versus more government control and more safety. So that's where I'm unmovable. But on other issues, in the short term, we're not going to get to any kind of libertarian society anytime soon, if ever. I realize that. So there has to be solutions in the interim that will get us closer to liberty, but also in a realistic way. That's a whole year's worth of shows there. And I'm not the expert on it. It's just a matter of personal opinion. So I admit, in some ways, I'm intolerant. I just feel that on the left, there is more passion that comes off as angry intolerance on the left. So covering that up. But this show is going to be about the rise of the red hats. When I say the term red hats, I'm talking about Trump supporters. I've been calling them red hats for years now because they represent a movement, and their common visual marker is wearing those Make America Great Again red hats. It's turned into more of a slander as other folks. I think Drudge had it up the other day, something about the red hats. For me, it's the The MAGA movement is what they want to be called. I've never really agreed with that, so I just call them red hats. It's not to be insulting. It's just what I call them. But that really ties into kind of the overarching tone of this show. So in the intro, if you watched it, there's a quote, challenging the baneful effects of the spirit of the party. That is an interpretation of a line from George Washington's farewell address that he wrote. He never spoke it. He wrote it in 1796. And I want to, this is something that some folks have probably read, maybe even referenced, but I would guess that a lot of folks have never heard these words. And it is, these words are never more timely than today, and really over the past few years, but it's culminating today in that the predictions that General Washington made have come true. And this is a little bit long, but I'm going to go ahead and read it. And we will put a link in the description, and be sure to subscribe. Also comment. Wes is reminding me to do that this morning. If you have any questions, if you have anything you want to comment on, we'll absolutely bring it up. I don't care what your viewpoint is. I don't care what your opinion is. If it's an argument that is considerable of discussion, we're definitely going to bring it up. So, and feel free to email us as well, shane@independencitizen.com. We'll get those, print them out, read them, and go from there. So it'll be like our mailbag we'll start doing as part of the show. But this is, and we'll bring this up on the screen as well. So this is a portion of Washington's farewell address that I wouldn't say I cherry picked, but to make the most sense of it, because it was really a very lengthy commitment he made about the dangers of factionism and the dangers of specifically political parties in the United States in this emerging nation he was part of. So these are Washington words. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of the party generally. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasional riot, ring a bell there, with recent events, and insurrection. It opens the door to foreign influence and corruption. And General Washington goes on further, expanding on that as far as foreign influence, and he's absolutely spot on. This spirit, unfortunately, is inseparable from our nature, having its roots in the strongest passions of humankind. It exists under different shapes in all governments, more or less stifled, controlled, or repressed. But in those of the popular form, it is seen in the greatest rankness, and it is truly their worst enemy. The nation which indulges toward another in habitual hatred or in habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and interests. Let that sink in a minute. There's a few lines, aside from the occasional riot and insurrection, that's an easy one, because you can say, well, the Capitol Hill riot and led to this, and it did. But what really stands out in these words, going back and reading them, it's been a while, but this line really stands out. But in those of the popular form, populism, it is seen in its greatest rankness. When we have overt factions, which, let's face it, only come in the form of political parties, which is, we celebrate them, we promote them. Other factions where we've been divided for hundreds of years would be along race, socioeconomic status, where those are not overt. You're not going and saying, rich people want to keep the poor people down, or vice versa. Or, we definitely have the race riots and all that, but it is still not overt. Very few people go in and cheerlead based upon strictly racial lines. That's arguable. Black Lives Matter. So, but I think that's a different faction as well, where it's people against law enforcement. But we can get into that later. But as far as open factionism, there's no doubt about it, political parties. And this is why Washington starts off with warning of the baneful effects of the spirit of the party, because that is the worst form of this tribalism. And with that, we're, get in kind of the evolution of how the Red Hats came to be, how the MAGA movement started. So really, and this is all recent events. It probably goes back further, but this is kind of, off the top of my head as I'm making notes this morning. In 1992, Ross Perot ran for president. He was the most successful third party, actually his independent candidate at the time, modern independent candidate. He had a strong showing. I believe he got 25% of the vote. We'll have to look that up. I could be wrong. But for a third party candidate, 33%, will sway the election dependent upon the Electoral College. So it's and that's, keep in mind, Ross Perot jumped out of the race in July of that year and jumped back in October. Now, there's reasons for that, and maybe I'll have his campaign leader, not necessarily the manager, Russ Verney, on a later episode. But with even dropping out for several months before the election, him coming back in, he still got about 25% of the vote. Actually, I want to look that up real fast. 18.9. Okay. So, and he was polling, I believe he was, when he dropped out, he was at about 25%. But no, he was at as high as 37%. He was tied with Clinton for second. So that was, I have both Bush and Clinton who tied. Yeah, so Bush and Clinton were tied for second place at 24%. Ross Perot was leading at 37%. That's astounding. So, and me having run the Libertarian Party, I know the challenges of third-party candidates. Getting on the ballot, actually getting your name printed on the ballot, is an extreme challenge. That eats up a ton of resources. Ross Perot was an incredible businessman, but also an incredible organizer who surrounded himself with folks that were tremendous at it. He had retirees from his company going around the country in RVs, gathering signatures, and really made an incredible run of it. But you had a movement form around his 1992 run, and you had the Reform Party form. So in 1996, he ran again under a third party, not as an independent, which made ballot access rules slightly easier. Not much, though. But that was really a anti-establishment movement. It was, I wouldn't call it populist, but it was starkly different from the Republican and Democrat parties. That I would consider that the start or the birth of a movement that got us away from the party establishment. And then from there, a decade later, you have Ron Paul doing it again in 2007 in his run. So he announced in 2007 for the 2008 election, and you had a complete anti-establishment movement form around him. And the folks that were supporting Ron Paul were fervent supporters. I'm sure most of you remember this, and many of the listeners maybe supported him. I have my John Wayne mug here. A man's got to have a creed, a code to live by. So I like that. But Ron Paul, and he ran again the next season, but that really started a movement where people were left only briefly without a home. They were disgusted with the Republican Party. They were looking for another personality to take the helm after Ron Paul lost the primary fight for the Republican nomination. And lo and behold, February 19th, 2009, Rick Santelli, who was a commentator on the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, called for a Tea Party. And that was the start of the Tea Party movement. And we'll play that clip for you.
Rick Santelli and Jason Roney of Sharma Capital are standing by at the CME Group in Chicago. And Rick, have you been listening to this conversation?
Listening to it, I've been just glued to it because Mr. Ross has nailed it. You know, the government is promoting bad behavior because we certainly don't want to put stimulus forth and give people a whopping $8 or $10 in their check and think that they ought to save it. And in terms of modifications, I'll tell you what, I have an idea. You know, the new administration's big on computers and technology. How about this, President and new administration? Why don't you put up a website to have people vote on the internet as a referendum to see if we really want to subsidize the losers' mortgages, or would we like to at least buy cars and buy houses in foreclosure and give them to people that might have a chance to actually prosper down the road and reward people that could carry the water instead of drink the water?
Hey, Rick,
that's a novel idea.
Hey, Rick, did you?
What? Who thought of that?
Yeah, they're like putty in your hands. Did you hear?
No, they're not, Joe. They're not like putty in our hands. This is America. How many of you people want to pay for your neighbor's mortgage that has an extra bathroom and can't pay their bills? Raise their hand. How about we all? President Obama, are you listening?
How about we all stop paying our mortgage? It's a moral hazard.
This is like mob rule here. I'm getting scared. I'm glad I'm.
Why don't you guys don't get scared,
some
Joe.
bricks and
They're
bats.
already scaring you. You know, Cuba used to have mansions and a relatively decent economy. They moved from the individual to the collective. Now they're driving 54 Chevys. Maybe the last great car to come out of Detroit.
They're driving them on water too, which is a little strange to watch at
There
times.
you go.
Hey, Rick, how about the notion that Wilbur pointed out you can go down to 2% on the mortgage?
You could go down to minus 2%.
And still have 40%, and still have 40% not be able to do it. So why are they in the house? Why are we trying to keep them in the house?
Mr. Summers is a great economist, but boy, I'd love the answer to that one.
Jason,
You get people fired up.
Jason, you want
We're
to?
thinking of having a Chicago Tea Party in July. All you capitalists that want to show up to Lake Michigan, I'm going to start organizing.
What are you dumping in? What are you dumping in this time? Housing,
We're going
cars?
to be dumping in some derivative securities.
Rick, I congratulate you on your new incarnation as revolutionary leader.
So that small clip started the Tea Party movement, which really lasted through 2016, still kind of kicking around today with organizations that still run it. But in 2016, you had another phenomenon called Donald Trump. So he announced for the 2016 election, came down those escalators with Melania, and was a starkly different candidate than we've ever seen. Not just in his beliefs that weren't really well articulated, but in his personality, his aggressiveness, his spirit and fight, which attracted a lot of those folks that were attracted to the Tea Party movement, which is anti-establishment, attracted to Ron Paul, which is anti-establishment, and then Ross Perot as well. So you had basically a string of folks look at Donald Trump and say, that guy's different. I want to support him. And you get into the danger that Washington talked about, which having too much fondness for a specific politician or candidate, which on the other side foments a lot of hatred from the opposing viewpoints or opposing factions. And naturally that evolved into this overt let's call it a political war that we saw before he won in 2016, beating Hillary Clinton. But that victory, him beating Hillary, which not a lot of us expected, cemented his place as the leader of this movement. And there was a lot of hope that he would do what I talked about in episode 1, which was take on the establishment. Take on the Paul Ryans, who was Speaker of the House at the time, get rid of Obamacare, lower taxes, build the wall he was talking about, all these things. That's another movement that I left out was the, what was it called? Minuteman or something like that. I forget. It was a whole border movement to stop immigration and build a wall. That I think that predated the Tea Party movement. But it was a lot of the same personality supporting that as well. And so he had all these populist ideas, and I say populist because they're popular, very, very popular concepts with a portion of the American electorate. And that made him but a hero in their eyes. And that evolved into such passion that exactly what Washington warned us of, those baneful effects of the spirit of the party, we saw it on January 6th. We've seen it many times before then. We're going to see it more. Folks that have their passions ignited and also feel robbed. People believe that the election was stolen from them. I do not. We can get into reasons in later episodes why I'm pretty confident mass election fraud did not occur. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of people have these beliefs that the election was stolen, Donald Trump was the rightful winner. And the worst part about this is, and I've heard it from my own father, I've heard it from others, people have lost confidence in voting. They literally are not going to go to the polls during the next election. At least they say that now, and I'd argue they probably will, because they think every election is rigged. They are disenfranchising themselves on a false belief spread by the lies of Donald Trump, his attorneys, all the folks that were out there spreading this misinformation that really couldn't be validated. It was just a bombshell is coming. You had Sidney Powell out there talking about the Kraken. You had Lynn Wood coming up with new conspiracy theory a minute that never came to fruition. And yet it was just feeding the hope of millions of people, I'd argue, that the election would be overturned and Donald Trump would serve another 4 years. And when that didn't happen, and no matter what they did, whether it was the courts rejecting the bogus lawsuits or what have you, it just inflamed their passion even more. And now I think that there's the faction that's deflated, especially after Donald Trump admitted that there's going to be a peaceful transition to power. He's not going to the inauguration, but whatever, at least he's going to admit that it is a partial concession. But in the end, you have, tying back to 1796, everything that George Washington spoke about. I disagree that we've had an insurrection just yet, although they want to call it that. I mean, I guess you can't argue it, but we've seen the occasional riot. We're going to see a lot more, and we're going to see, unfortunately, domestic terrorism. And that's what I fear the most, is the loss of life based upon political beliefs that we're gonna see. Look, civil unrest is nothing new in America. You have going back to really the birth of our nation, outside of the Revolutionary War, we've had riots and unrest, hundreds of them, that are notable and listed in history, that I don't know how many lives were taken, but most of it revolves around race, segregation, and this is, before the 60s, you had the Night of the Axe Handles, I believe, where you had people going around beating black men who were speaking up, for their rights. And it's rare that any riots will actually directly affect federal leaders. And that's why they're freaking out right now in Congress, because their sacred ground was trampled on. So they're scared. But the federal force that they've sent out into the nation throughout history, take a look at 1968 DNC protests, where there was 152 police injured, 500 protesters injured. I don't believe anybody was killed. That was over Vietnam. And that was folks objecting to the policies of the federal government. You can call that an insurrection. Same thing in 1970, just 2 years later, Kent State. 4 students were gunned down in a volley of gunfire by National Guard troops. Then you get into the overt factionism based upon race. You had the 79 Greensboro massacre, which was, you had communist sympathizers and the KKK clashing. 5 were killed. Fast forward to 92 in the LA riots over Rodney King. There were thousands of people injured. There were 63 deaths and those riots all over police brutality. That was a community coming together outraged by government action. Not the federal government, but if you think about what happened in LA back then compared to what happened on Capitol Hill on January 6th, pales in comparison. LA riots were frightening, but it wasn't affecting members of Congress. And so they sat back and kind of like with all the Black Lives Matter protests we saw in 2020, there were not members of Congress. A lot of members of Congress were cheering them on while they were out on the streets, burning down buildings, rioting, and they weren't offering any solutions to quell the violence either. But when it walks into their doors, that's when they freak out and start arresting everybody. Go to 2011 Wisconsin protests. The Wisconsin State House was occupied by protesters for 18 days. Think about that. If that happened on Capitol Hill and the reaction of the federal government, that would be extraordinary. Again, I'm getting into kind of the overreaction by the government right now, although people lost their lives. It was tragic, but still, compared to what else has happened in our history, it's not what they're saying it is. But again, back to the Red Hats. It's something that you could see it coming. You can see when people's passions are so high, whether opposing Donald Trump or supporting Donald Trump, that it's going to lead to problems like we've seen, especially with a lack of leadership. And Donald Trump, I'll say it now, has not led his supporters in a positive manner. He's used them as a tool. He's taken advantage of them. He's treated them like lemmings, literally having them, carry pitchforks to the Capitol with the intent of burning it down. And that is sheer arrogance and ignorance on his part to think that that is an acceptable role of a national leader. So I'm sympathetic in the end. I'm sympathetic to Donald Trump supporters. I'm sympathetic in that they've been taken advantage of. They've had their passions taken advantage of by a leader who did not have their interests in heart, that was selfishly trying to retain power, regardless of the cost, regardless of the consequences to the nation or anyone else. It was a selfish act. And so while I disagree with a lot of Trump supporters and their blind defense of this man, in the end, it's no different from a cult leader. It's no different from, an extreme religious leader, leading his flock astray for financial benefit or anything else. He did it for power. And that's what happens when, you have this populist groupthink. I think I've rambled on enough for this episode, but we're going to get back to it in a day or two and talk about a few other things, maybe address some completely opposite things outside of the party and politics. We'll see what happens. But thanks for joining. Don't forget, subscribe as long as you care to see this content again, and comment. Let us know what you think, and we'll air that. Thanks so much.